Plovers, 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 why do you do this? Oh, you're back. So yes, after the last successful ID episode on juvenile marshal versus juvenile African crowned eagle, I thought I'd tackle a slightly more difficult subject. And it's something that doesn't only trip up beginner birders, but some of the more advanced birders too. And I'm talking about this bird on the screen now. Now clearly, with a bit of experience, this is a juvenile Kittlitz plover. But when you start trying to identify the various nuances you get of juvenile Kittlitz plover, you find if you just use standard field guides, things tend to unravel really quickly. And as a result, in researching this video, I used quite a range of books, which you see off to the side here. So I've got a whole bunch of notes here, and literally this is what it takes to tackle the subject. So let's dive into it. So if you start looking at the field guides, they list a couple of features that separate juvenile Kittlitz plover from the two sand plovers, and I'll get to some of the taxonomy in a moment. But essentially, the guides tend to state that the Kittlitz plover has a rich buff wash to the belly, which separates it from the sand plovers that have a white belly. If you start looking at some of these screen recordings from some of the apps, you will very quickly see that there are juvenile Kittlitz plovers that clearly have a white belly. And that's where the confusion starts and things just unravel really, really quickly. So we've already established that you're not guaranteed to always have a buff wash to the belly on Kittlitz plover. And this is where birders start to get excited. The second feature mentioned is that there's a broad buff collar on Kittlitz plover that separates the juveniles from the sand plovers. We go back and look at some of the apps, and you will very quickly see that, and here's some examples actually from Wikimedia Commons, you will see that you get sand plovers that clearly have a collar. So it really starts to become quite tenuous to just simply use collar and belly color to separate Kittlitz plover from the two sand plovers. There's another interesting thing that's also mentioned is dark feather centers, giving the juvenile Kittlitz plover a more scalloped look. But when I go to what I consider the so-called Bible of waders, Shorebirds, a hand guide to the identification of the waders of the world, it actually states that a juvenile Kittlitz can look very plain and very, very close to the smaller of the two sand plovers. I haven't given the name yet because now I'm just going to delve into some of the taxonomy. There have been some name changes and some taxonomy updates. So let's just have a look at the birds we're talking about. Firstly, Kittlitz is the one under discussion. And Kittlitz, it's remained Kittlitz, there's no changes there. If you then look, we get greater sand plover here, and it's remained greater sand plover. To be specific, we get the Crassirostris subspecies or race in southern Africa, and that's actually quite advantageous because it is one of the larger of the races, which helps when it comes to separating the two sand plovers themselves, which I'll deal with in a moment. Then you get lesser sand plover, which was also previously known as Mongolian sand plover. It has now been split. We used to get the Pamirensis race, which is the smaller of the lesser sand plover races, which again is advantageous when separating lesser and greater, but that has now become Tibetan sand plover. So before anyone comments on the video that they follow a different taxonomic order, it's not really up for debate. You know, a taxonomy debate on another video is a separate thing. For my ID videos and the purpose of Southern African ID, I conform to the latest master lists from worldbirdnames.org, and that's where I get that taxonomy from. So we've already seen that there's inherently some problems in trying to separate some juvenile Kittlitz plovers from Tibetan sand plover in non-breeding plumage. And in actual fact, this book says that it's a lot more difficult than the simple premise that some of our field guides use. So let's have a look at how you go about actually separating these tricky birds. So first off, there is a rich buff wash to the belly and the chest. Obviously, you've seen in examples that rich buff wash can fade away and you're left with a white belly. But wherever around the chest, the flanks, any of those sorts of areas, you've got a lovely, warm, rich buff wash, that already would rule out your two sand plovers. However, some books cite the darker brown patches on the sides of the chest for the sand plovers. This book again cites, beware, that juvenile Kittlitz plovers can also have those dark brown patches on the sides of the chest. So the main thing you're looking for is any rich buff wash. But if it's not there, what else do we have? So the next thing is the length of the legs. Kittlitz has longer legs than Tibetan sand plover, and more in keeping proportionately with the long legs for the body size of, say, greater sand plover. And what this means, and you can see from this image of a Kittlitz plover in flight, the toes project quite nicely beyond the tail tip in flight. Tibetan sand plover, shorter legs, and if you look at this photo of some Tibetan sand plovers in flight, you'll see that there's very little to no toe projection at all. And then when we go back to the greater sand plover, here's another photo, again showing that greater sand plover has quite a nice toe projection beyond the tail. So that's quite helpful. The other thing that's useful, you don't always see it, so you must be wary relying on it, but Kittlitz plover has dark, lesser coverts on the wing. And this can show itself as a darker patch on the shoulder of the folded wing. If you see that, that's a very, very good feature to separate juvenile Kittlitz plover from the sand plovers. But of course, the problem you have with all of this is a lot of it becomes subjective, and particular when I tried to delve into the differences of greater and lesser, or now Tibetan sand plovers from each other, there's very little to go on plumage-wise, and it's predominantly structural. So I'm going to go into some of those differences now. So firstly, Kittlitz is the smallest. You're looking at 12 to 14 centimeters, 38 grams. So it's a fairly small bird. Next, you've got Tibetan sand plover, which is roughly about 15 to 18 centimeters, and it weighs in the region of 55 grams. So already you'll see Tibetan sand plover and Kittlitz can be fairly similar in size, so quite tricky to judge when you're not seeing them next to each other. And then we've got the large one, the greater sand plover. You're looking at 22 to 25 centimeters, a staggering 90 grams. It's nearly 3 times the weight of a Kittlitz plover. So size already there is a guide. But now the very useful thing, once you've looked at the toes and you've looked at the size, is the size of the bill in relation to the head. Firstly, on Kittlitz, the length of the bill is at maximum the same length as, but can be even shorter than the distance from the base of the bill to the back of the eye. And you can see it here nicely on this image. Similarly, Tibetan sand plover also has a small bill, and also the length of the bill is the same as or even less than the distance of the base of the bill to the back of the eye. Then you get to greater sand plover, and if you look at this picture already, the bill is monstrous. But the bill is bigger, and often substantially bigger, than the distance from the base of the bill to the back of the eye. So that really is one of your key structural differences, aside from size, when you're separating lesser and greater sand plovers. So really, that in a nutshell is the simple way to do it. There are other features on juvenile Kittlitz plover where if your supercilium, your eyebrow, extends all the way back and joins the collar, forming an inverted T, then that is a good indication of Kittlitz plover. However, you do see Kittlitz plover where that eyebrow starts to become a bit indistinct and it doesn't always meet up with the collar, forming that T, which then makes it more difficult again. So really, Kittlitz plover can become very, very tricky when it's not sticking to the textbook identification features as used in a typical field guide, which granted tends to take the typical birds. But your problem is these funny juvenile Kittlitz plovers trip people up. They often get excited. They often think they've seen a lesser sand plover, and I've made that mistake too in the past. And they get all excited only to have their hopes dashed to be told, no, it's actually just a juvenile Kittlitz. So this is a really tricky group of 3 birds. I hope this video has helped hugely. And please subscribe to our channel. Share this video with your friends. I'm sure many, many birders would find this video useful. And we'll see you soon on another bird identification video.